Jamie, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, we were transported back to the Balkans.
The city was ruled by Serb snipers, yes, John tells the court. But there was another kind of sniper who seemed different from the rest. He saw them roaming the streets of the city on multiple occasions, and they stood out. Firstly, their clothes. They wore a sort of civilian military combination. Secondly, their guns. They carried enormous, unusual weapons that looked better suited to, quote, hunting boar in the Black Forest than in urban combat in the Balkans.
Okay, so that's Hala Mohideen hosting a video for Al Jazeera English called, Jamie, The Human Hunters of Sarajevo. You can watch the whole thing on their YouTube channel. Tell us what's been happening this week.
So this week, prosecutors in Milan, Italy, have opened an investigation into alleged sniper tourism during the Sarajevo siege. So the allegation is that foreign nationals, most immediately Italians, but there are thoughts that there were others from around Europe, paid large sums, somewhere in the region between 80,000 to 100,000 euros, to Bosnian Serb forces so they could be transported to sniper positions overlooking Sarajevo and shoot at civilians effectively for sport.
I mean, it's hard to know what reaction to say to that, apart from WTF. Was there an inclination before that anything like sniper tourism had or could happen in any war in the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting for me because my dad actually worked in Sarajevo and Mostar during the war for the UN. And when he told me stories about it, it was actually one of the stories that he told quite regularly were about kind of drunk stag doos from around the Balkans who would go and would basically pay to go and take part in the war, basically. So I kind of knew this was something that existed. So I was quite surprised when it came up as news this week. But I guess this in detail is because there was a documentary an Italian guy did 3 years ago, the Sarajevo Safari film, which kind of triggered renewed interest in this. And then this Milan journalist, Enzio Gavazzini, he then compiled a complaint, and that's got to the Milan's prosecutor's office. So I guess with this kind of thing, there might have been a lot of knowledge of it, but until you get the kind of scene written out, I mean, and some of the details of it are absolutely horrendous. You know, there was a kind of notion within this, the allegations put together for the prosecutor's office, there was a notions that there was a price list, so you could pay more to shoot children, and then if you wanted to shoot adult men, especially in uniform, and then women, whereas older people might be cheaper or free. And then you also look at the kind of logistical route that they went through. The allegations are that particularly Italians would go through from meeting in Trieste and then pretend that they were on humanitarian missions. Like I say, I mean, we've talked about war tourism before, I guess, but that's always been mercenaries. This is something much more horrific, which is civilians basically going and hunting for sport.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely horrendous in principle. I suppose you start thinking, Harriet, whether it is so different maybe from people who volunteer to join wars that otherwise they wouldn't be part of. What are the motivations of people who go out there as mercenaries to places like Ukraine, for example? Sometimes, I suppose, it is about getting your hands on a gun. So is that so different to, as brazenly as this, allegedly paying just to shoot someone?
That's a really good question that I haven't got the answer to, except to say that it feels different, that there is, I think, a difference somehow between joining a war and fighting and taking a lot of risk, personal risk yourself, whether that's for money or ideological or national reasons, versus what the allegations are here, which is tourism that you wouldn't risk yourself. The allegations are that these tourists were placed on the mountains around Sarajevo, because Sarajevo is kind of in a basin within all these mountains. And the allegation is that they would be posted in these mountains and shooting down with sniper rifles purely for the purposes of thrill or tourism or some sort of sadistic impulse. And there were similar allegations made during the civil war in Lebanon between the 70s and the 90s, that when Beirut was separated into two halves and there was this no man's land in between, the allegation was that tourist shooters was the expression, that they would come and participate in that way. But it feels different.
No, I think that is a good distinction. Yes, they weren't putting themselves at risk. And also, Felicity, they were shooting civilians. I mean, I suppose the point is that the army that they were joining was also shooting civilians, but nonetheless, that's different maybe to joining an army and shooting members of an opposing army?
I think it has to be different. I mean, this is so sadistic. It's for pleasure. Sometimes they were shooting at people in uniforms, but other times it was civilians, other times it was children. I think one of the most moving cases was the Romeo and Juliet of Sarajevo. It was a couple who were shot by snipers on a bridge, and their bodies lay there for 4 days before anyone can get to them. And at the time, I think it, made headlines just because it was just so awful and so moving. But there were also reports of children being shot, a small child who was holding onto his mother's hand. I mean, just like the absolute worst of humanity depicted in the story. And when I was doing the research and looking at all the articles come with images of ordinary people like grimacing, cowering away from these snipers, and some Bosnian shooters trying to fire back, but just the sheer kind of terror and just being hunted by fellow humans. It's just, I haven't seen a story like this for such a long time. And for ages there have been rumours, and it's almost like a kind of urban legend or myth or something that everyone was talking, well, not everyone was talking about, but there were definitely rumours, and it seemed like
people who were there suspected. Yeah,
that was suspected. There were eyewitnesses. It kind of seemed plausible, but now hopefully the momentum is building that there is real hard evidence coming to light, and maybe some justice can be sought.
I mean, just to be clear, actually, Jamie, when you said what your dad had reported to you anecdotally, was he talking about people joining as snipers on stag groups, or was he talking about in another capacity turning up to witness or support the army?
I think both. So it was kind of fairly well known that, because I think, and this is what Felicity was saying, which I think was so crucial to discussing the Balkan War, is that it was one of the first wars to be televised, like 24/7, to have news outlets that were showing in the nightly news things that would happen that day. Talking to my dad and his friends, some of whom still live in the former Yugoslavia, they would be shown on TV exactly the kind of ease with which people were getting killed in Sarajevo if you were on the Serbian side. It was kind of seen as something that was done, that was without risk. I think he was saying that, so people could go get drunk on a weekend, go and be given guns, fight for a bit, come back. I think that the really shocking thing about it is that perhaps we don't know the scale of people that were involved outside of maybe the former Yugoslavia, because my understanding with my dad was that these were maybe Serbians that weren't involved in the military. Obviously, this prosecution is about Italians, but there is also talk of other Europeans that would fly over. It doesn't stretch the imagination to realize that once some people had this, sadistic urge or pleasure, it could spread quite easily. But I think the 24/7 news angle is something that's really important, particularly about the Balkans, because it just did show people exactly what was going on. And that's the really scary thing about the 4 years that Sarajevo was in the siege, was that we in the UK couldn't hide behind not knowing what was going on. And we in the UK took real deliberate decisions not to get involved. And if you go to Sarajevo, which I would really recommend, it's Bosnia is one of the best countries I've ever visited, and with some of the most beautiful people in the world. And they really do feel let down by the United Nations and by the West, more generally, because for 4 years there was a siege taking place, and people got the video, they got the images, and they didn't do anything. One of the things that was so shocking, for the UK at least, was that these people did unfortunately look quite like us, and it was close to us in the same way that we talk about Ukraine at the same time. And for a number of reasons, the government didn't decide to step in, and the UN didn't do enough. So there's maybe that will come up more and more, with this stuff. If this story continues, maybe we'll have to relook at our role and the role of the West in the Sarajevo siege, which I think is worth doing.
Yeah, 11,000 plus people died in that siege. And thank you for bringing it to us, because it gives us the opportunity to look at it and look at some of the history. I mean, Harriet, were you surprised by anything you learnt looking into the background of this war? It isn't much talked about. I realise listeners in Croatia or Bosnia would disagree with me, but in Britain, we don't talk about what happened very much over there.
Yeah, no, there was this book that came out by this Italian journalist, Luca Leone, in 2014 about this. So this has been kind of rumbling along in the background. But what I think is really important to talk about is that the war in Bosnia might have ended, but the conflict certainly hasn't. Bosnia is still incredibly divided along ethnic and national and political lines. Like, after the war ended, and this was the worst violence since World War II. I mean, 100,000 people, millions of people displaced in this war. in the 1990s, like this is in my lifetime. And the peace accord that ended the war, it did stop the killing, but it just froze the conflict by splitting the country into two halves. So at the moment, you've got the Serbian Republic, which is like the autonomous Bosnian Serbian region, and the Federation of Bosnian Muslims and Croats. So you've got like Muslim Bosnians and Catholic Croats on one side and Orthodox Serbs on the other. So ethnic lines, national lines, religious lines. And the problem is that kind of stopped Bosnia developing into like a functional state. And things have been getting really tense all year, like this intense nationalism. And the president of the Bosnian Serb entity was sentenced to a year in prison for separatism. And he denies the Srebrenica genocide. He says that Bosnia has ceased to exist. He openly discusses the possibility of succeeding. He's like a major ally of Putin, backed by Hungary, backed by Serbia. So the EU and the UN, yes, there is an EU peacekeeping force there, but Bosnia is still a major flashpoint, and we can still say that the West isn't doing enough, even though Bosnia was given candidate status for EU membership a few years ago. The EU saying, well, it can't become an EU member until it does this, this, and this, all of this reform, all of this, like bring together its fragmented landscape, but it actually can't do that because of the Serbian region and the separatism that is backed by Russia and kind of now China as well, but there's a lot of Russian money going into training them all. So I think a real key takeaway here is that this conflict in Bosnia, the war might have ended, but the conflict is still ongoing and the West is still looking away from it.
Yeah, there's also been a sort of patchy record, I guess, on bringing some of these war criminals to justice. Felicity, how likely do you think it is that those involved in this, if it is proven these allegations of sniper tourism, will be brought to justice?
Well, like you say, on the one hand, it has taken such a long time for any of the perpetrators to be brought to justice. Radovan Karadzic, the former Bosnian Serb leader, was found guilty of genocide and other crimes against humanity in 2016. So that was a hell of a long time after the offences he committed. And also, you know, some of the perpetrators are still active in political life in Serbia. And what's more, they're regarded as heroes. Some of them are mentioned in school textbooks, in history books. Even when you look at this story, like a lot of Serbs are like outraged at the story and deny that it's true. And, you know, they see the conflict in a completely different way from, you know, how we're talking about it. To date, not one of these snipers has been brought to justice. So there's that to bear in mind. And also, I think up until now, you know, this kind of hearsay, do we know the numbers? Do we have the dates? That sort of thing would have made it seem more unlikely that they wouldn't be brought to justice. However, on the other hand, a lawyer who was working with Gavazzini said that the evidence accumulated after such a long investigation is well substantiated, that identities have been made and individuals will be questioned. So it sounds like it has taken all this time and kind of meticulous and painstaking investigation to be in a position where they can actually go to individuals and try and get the evidence they need, rather than it just being sort of, you know, a few rumours. So it depends what the strength of their evidence is. I mean, they've got to get it right. I mean, it would be awful to wrongly accuse someone of what we're talking about. It's absolutely horrific, and it wouldn't do anything for tensions in the region to get this wrong. But it sounds as though the lawyers and journalists working on this are sort of quietly confident that they have now amassed the evidence they need.
And if that's right, then, Jamie, do you predict that it will spread to other nationalities who might have taken part in this? What do you think will happen next in this situation and for Bosnia more generally?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to say. I mean, it's worth saying, obviously, as I think I did earlier, is that at the moment it does seem to be just the Italian prosecutors that are the ones that are bringing it together, and there hasn't been actual, you know, we're only looking at one, the kind of initial starting point for the prosecution. You can't say other nationalities, but I think while this tension exists in the Serbian Republic of Bosnia, a lot of the war crimes, a lot of the cases will continue to go unsolved. A lot of the people who are alleged to be involved are kind of living with impunity in the Serbian Republic, and because of the fear of the repercussions and the kind of taking sides, Russians backing, Orban is a big backer of the Serbian Republic in Bosnia. Because of this kind of like taking sides angle, people don't want to kind of ruffle feathers, which is, really sad, because as we know, with all of the things, like all of the war crimes and the stuff that we talk about on this podcast, quite a lot of it is that until a country, gets justice, until victims feel like they're heard, they can't move on. If you go to Bosnia, a lot of people will say that they haven't moved on from what's happened. It's less than 30 years in some cases from some of the atrocities. And if there isn't justice and the people aren't brought to justice, and not only that, but like Felicity was saying, they are involved in military and seen as heroes in some parts of the country, it's really hard to see how the country moves forward. And that's a real worry and concern.
All right, Felicity, it is your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A small voice of resistance goes viral.
The sound of teenager Diana Logineva singing in the street in a performance which went viral on October the 15th. Of what song, Felicity, and what's the story?
So that is a performance of a band track called the Swan Lake Cooperative, which is a track by an exiled anti-Kremlin Russian rapper called Noise MC. And it's gone viral on social media. It's being performed by Diana Logineva, as you mentioned, this 18-year-old who sings in a group called Stop Time with her boyfriend, now fiance. He proposed to her in a police van. And the story is that this week she has been sent back to prison for another 13 days, having previously spent 2 stints already in prison of 13 days.
For that, for singing that song we just heard.
For that song and for others, there's another one that is disliked by the authorities called "You Are a Soldier," by another singer who has also left the country and been designated a foreign agent, and that is disliked by the authorities because the lyrics are "You're a soldier, and whatever war you are fighting, I'm sorry, I'll be on the other side," and that kind of is reflected in the charges against her. So she's been detained for a public order offence, petty hooliganism. This last one, she was found guilty of organising the mass gathering of people, but also there are signs that she could be detained again for discrediting the army. And that's a really big deal now in Russia, obviously, since the invasion of 2022. New charges have been brought in that you can't say things against the army because obviously the Kremlin are terrified of anything that doesn't suggest total cohesion and total support of what he's up to. And
actually, just before we broaden this out, just explain to us why performing a song called the Swan Lake Cooperative is controversial, because it is fascinating.
Yes, it's very interesting. So Swan Lake, obviously a Tchaikovsky ballet, that is seen in Russia as music that symbolises political change because it was shown on state TV on a loop. It would just go endlessly round and round and round. After the death of Soviet leaders and during the 1991 coup against Gorbachev, the last Soviet president. So as the tanks were rolling in, TV was all switched to just showing these fabulous ballerinas dressed as swans on stage. So it's that music that everyone knows, it means something more in Russia.
Yeah. Which is fascinating. And Harriet, I didn't know that. But the strange thing about this story is I sort of did know that if you speak out against Putin in Russia, you get arrested and thrown in prison. It's not news. This is just a very stark example, isn't it? Because it is a teenage girl in a street performance. It's so innocuous. She's not Pussy Riot. She's just standing there singing. She's busking.
Yeah, although to be fair, originally Pussy Riot was teenage girls singing in the street, making a music video.
Yeah, true.
Do you know what I mean?
But it's not a big arty performance, is it? It is, it seems so innocuous from a Western perspective.
I think that the takeaway is that the repression in Russia, the crackdown, like the authoritarian power grab of Putin has just ramped up so much over the past 10 years. Like first with the annexation of Crimea and then like the economic struggles and then obviously the invasion of Ukraine. His grasp on Russia and his crackdown on any kind of dissent has been increasing and increasing and increasing. And there's so many new laws, like not just against kind of impugning the regime or against the Orthodox Church, but also anything like about saying anything about the army or the war in Ukraine or like anti-LGBT laws, any mention or education around any LGBT issue is now completely banned. And the death of Alexei Navalny last year, who was, I guess, the focal point of Russian opposition, kind of since then, even though tens of thousands of people have been protesting. And I do think that that's really important to mention, that people are still protesting, not just against Putin, but also against the war in Ukraine, despite the fact that it's basically illegal. Thousands and thousands of people protesting, but Russian opposition has sort of lost its focal point, and there's all sorts of dissent now, because most of the opposition dissidents usually are outside Russia, so there's not really like any kind of cohesion. But yeah, this is a very stark example of the kind of iron grasp that Putin now has on Russian society.
But it could backfire, couldn't it, Jamie, from Putin's perspective, in the sense that, as Felicity referred to, both she and her boyfriend are often pictured together. They're both quite photogenic teenagers. You know, this video had already gone viral. People will latch onto them as heroes for being clamped down on, you know, not just being disciplined, but thrown in prison multiple times.
Yeah, and I mean, it actually links back to the discussion that we were having about the ICE performances and how you go about dissent in areas that are heavily cracked down upon. You know, Amnesty International put it that like their only crime is singing songs that challenge the suffocating official narrative. That was the quote that they put out. It is interesting in the broader context of how young people, you know, street musicians, cultural actors are part of the dissent. And I think what, you know, Harriet was talking about, what also is worth remembering is that the kind of younger generation of protesters now, they have no memory of anything but Putin's rule. And their motivations then obviously differ from earlier waves. It's not about what came before. It's about how can we still protest in a country that is, you know, becoming more and more oppressed in lots of ways. There's another angle to this whole thing, which is about what forms of protest will go viral, what forms of protest will actually make a big scenes, and whether that is a new route for the opposition in Russia, particularly because, like Harriet says, a lot of the actual opposition politicians and stuff are exiled. So within Russia, what are the ways in which young people and cultural actors can make a protest?
And can it spread freely on social media there? Felicity, we've talked about this sort of thing with regard to other, even more oppressive states like Iran or Saudi Arabia, for example, where people make a protest and then it still manages somehow to go across their social networks, even though technically, you know, they're in a regime where they're not supposed to be freely posting stuff. Do Russians have access to criticism of Putin's government? The way it's often presented to us is they're still watching state television, so they get the state line and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, her videos have gone viral on social media. They're all over TikTok. The crowds themselves that are coming to see are sort of like dozens of people rather than like hundreds or thousands. But on social media, it has like lit up like wildfire. And it really movingly, and what's quite poignant is that it's sparked solidarity concerts across Russia. So there's been several incidents of other street musicians and buskers playing the same band tracks, also being detained for the same thing, for petty hooliganism or discreditation of the armed forces. But I think that's really moving, that it's other young people who are musical, who are kind of, standing up together in solidarity. It's these very cruel cat and mouse tactics that the authorities are employing in each case, is that they will detain them for no more than 13 days, which doesn't seem that punitive. It doesn't seem that terrible. They're not being carted off to a penal colony, which we know does happen and is what happened to Pussy Riot. But just as they're coming out again, they're back in for another trumped up charge. And that could just go on and on and on, which is quite scary. But as you were saying, Olly, I think it is a story that has caught the attention of some of the international media, because it's, I guess it is a wonderful story of young people standing up to a very authoritarian regime that they're not happy with.
Yeah, although to be fair, obviously when when Pussy Riot were most active back in 2012, when it was just young women in brightly coloured dresses and like 80s acid tights, 2 of them were sentenced to 2 years in prison in 2013. 2 years in prisons that had these horrendous conditions of torture and psychological torture and physical torture. And those sentences sparked protests in Russia, sparked international protests. Like Sting spoke out for their release. So did Madonna. When they were eventually released in what a lot of people considered to be kind of a PR bit for Putin ahead of the Winter Olympics in Sochi in 2014, they performed in New York with Hillary Clinton. So this is, I think, first of all, nothing new as such, but the social media aspect, I think, is that does make it different, and also the situation in Russia is so different as well. I mean, when Alexei Navalny died last year, allegedly murdered by Putin's regime, tens of thousands of people protested and turned out for his funeral, like despite the fact that that is illegal. So it's not to say that the spirit of dissent or activism against authoritarianism is dead in Russia. I think what is fair to say is that it is so much more dangerous now, so much more difficult, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight for Putin's regime either. I mean, he's on track to be in power until 2036. So given that his regime is being so increasingly bolstered by China and so kind of internationally, like none of the sanctions are working, none of the support for Ukraine seems to be working necessarily, I don't think things are going to get much easier for dissidents in Russia. Although, to be fair, I think Yulia Navalny, who is the widow of Alexei Navalny, who I saw speak last year at the South Bank Center when she was promoting his memoir, Patriot, she's very famously now kind of put herself in the limelight in his after his death, even though she had never really wanted that. She's sort of been like, okay, well, I have to step in now and lead the opposition from outside of Russia, and has said that she will run as president for Russia once Putin is out. So there's not to say that there aren't still leadership figures in the opposition, and it's not to say that resistance in Russia is dead. It's just so much more dangerous.
And they're not particularly united either. There's an awful lot of infighting amongst the opposition groups, like really bad infighting with all sorts of issues going on. And like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, he's a big opposition figure, but him and the Navalny camp do not get on at all. So not only do they not have that charismatic leader like Navalny with his political skills and his ability to get the headlines and get the attention and get people on side, but they don't even have that kind of unity amongst themselves, which I think is not looking good. But I mean, on the other hand, Putin hasn't done anything really, as far as I can see, not that I'm in his inner circle, but he hasn't done anything to groom the next, like there's going to have to be another leader of Russia at some point, and I can't see who the next leader is going to be. I haven't seen him grooming his successor. So, look how quickly the Soviet Union collapsed. It happened very rapidly. Like, a great change might happen.
It's also, I mean, you mentioned Navalny, Jamie, dying in prison, and I think it's fairly uncontroversial to suggest that was at the doing of the Russian government. But, in this case, yes, they've given her a ridiculously punitive sentence, 12 days in prison, whatever it is, for singing a song. But on the other hand, there's only so far they can push it without losing public support, isn't there? And so you wonder if there could be a groundswell here, because she isn't a Navalny figure. She's not trying to lead a political movement, she's just singing a song. Lots of young girls might get in the street and start singing songs. And then what do? You can't be too punitive, because you want to be the kind of country that says, we allow young girls to sing in the street. That's why we're fighting in Ukraine. At the same time, you don't want to sing in the street because she's spreading these messages you don't want out there.
When I was doing the reading around this, there's a lot of stuff about, and actually on the Week's website, we have quite a lot of stories about kind of like what do Russians think of the war? What's Russian life like in Moscow? What's life? And the kind of overwhelming thing is that people aren't necessarily for the war, but what they are for is continued kind of conformity and continuing to live their lives. That's a generalization in some respects, but a lot of the, I was doing the reading, a lot of the academic scholarly stuff around the kind of roots of Russian cultural traits of being conservative, pessimistic, avoidant of change, So it would take a lot, I think, for them to really want to take on Putin, particularly as Felicity says, when it's so divided in terms of the opposition. But I guess things like this do show the kind of cultural angle and that feeling of like, oh, what can we do while obviously continuing with our day-to-day lives? How can we show that we're not fully behind what's happening in Russia? And you know, you only have to look at what happened to Yevgeny Prigozhin, when he showed some form of opposition to Putin, and he was seen as maybe a successor at one stage, and when he was on side with Putin. I do think that Putin would shut down any type of opposition. I guess there is a feeling within Russia that until there's a real massive opposition, this kind of stuff, singing on the street, cultural stuff, can at least show something and make some difference to people's lives.
Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week the London Aquarium got into hot water?
Past the sharks and clownfish, we got to the penguin point. The birds are found in this dark room. While some seem content in the water, other Gentoo penguins appeared so bored they were motionless, seemingly staring at the wall. Do you think they've got enough room?
No, not really. Not really.
Do you think they should be freed?
Yeah. Yes, they should be freed.
Yeah, I don't think they should be in captivity, to be honest.
Rag Martell reporting for ITV News, speaking to visitors at the London Aquarium on the South Bank. Harriet, what's the story?
Well, the story is those penguins. There's these 15 Gentoo penguins at London Sea Life Aquarium, which is just not too far away from me actually, and they are kept in that aquarium without any natural light or fresh air, with quite a shallow pool and what is kind of the ground floor, but is also a little bit, because of the layout of the building, is a little bit like a basement. And this week, 75 MPs from across the political spectrum signed an open letter calling for an urgent review into this situation. And they're asking the Environment Secretary to consider whether the penguins should be relocated to a facility that's better aligned with their needs.
It's really interesting that you brought this to the table and, that this has become an issue, because I've been visiting that aquarium for, 20 years. I've taken my kids. And every time I get to the penguins at the end, my heart sings, because it is really dispiriting as someone who likes animals. Aquariums are great because, you can argue about whether fish should be in captivity too, but obviously they've got smaller brains and bigger tanks. There's all the beautiful colours and all the rest of it. And then you get to the end and it is just this really miserable display of animals that are obviously supposed to be outside, being kept inside with a weird UV light and kids breathing all over them, and it's horrible. But why now? Why has this suddenly come to a head now? Because like I say, that's been the experience of visiting London Aquarium forever.
So they originally came from Edinburgh Zoo in 2011. And so they've been in this place for 14 years, and opposition has been building. So campaign group Freedom for Animals launched a campaign last year and a petition that's got, tens of thousands of signatures. And last summer, an MP, a Lib Dem MP, Danny Chambers, who's also a veterinary surgeon, tabled a motion to support the campaign. And there was a big open letter signed by naturalist Chris Packham and loads of other celebrities last August. And campaign groups have been protesting regularly outside the aquarium ever since, as recently as last month. The issue is that what can you do with them? This is an Antarctic species, the Gentoo penguin, and they need specific enclosures that like lighting that would match what's found in the southern hemisphere. You can't. There's all sort. Basically, we can go into the details of why. There's all sorts of issues with what can be done with them, but the opposition has been building. The problem is that there are penguins kept all over the UK.
Felicity, this strikes me as something that would be of interest to your readers at the Week Junior. What do you make of it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you saw the kids in the clip just then who weren't happy about it, and our readers have always been huge animal lovers, and we have a whole spread dedicated to animals and the environment, and it's something that's very, very close to their heart. I can't tell you how many photos we get of various pets looking at the magazine, eating the magazine, chewing it up. So yeah, I think they would probably they would probably get behind this. But it's just it's funny to me that you were saying, Ollie, that you had visited them multiple times, and I wonder how many people have, including kids who have gone past it, felt really dispirited, but nothing's really been done about it. And I think one of the MPs said that it's un-British what's going on, which made me laugh so much, because I also thought it's also un-British for anyone to kind of raise their head above the parapet and make a complaint when they go and see these poor creatures. But I mean, they're a fascinating species, as Harriet was saying. I think they're the third biggest penguin, and they're amazing divers. So they can dive 600 feet in depth, I think that's right, and they can swim up to 22 miles per hour and hold their breath for 7 minutes. They're the fastest swimming bird in the world, and that makes it all the more sad that they have this tiny enclosure. I can't remember the depth of the tank, but it's certainly
it's less than 2 meters.
It's less than 2 meters, and I mean, that's not what they're doing in the wild at all. But as Harriet was saying, what do you do with them? I think the a spokesperson for Merlin Entertainment said, we can't just release them into the wild. That's not an option now.
No, but is that an option that people realistically want, Harriet? I mean, I saw that statement as well, but I don't think that's what people are saying. They're saying, well, I've been to other zoos and I've seen penguins out in much nicer, pools than this. Is it really not possible to relocate them there?
I'd also want to know why Edinburgh Zoo agree to give them to Merlin Entertainments, knowing that this would be their new habitat? Because
that's why we had the independence referendum up here. It was basically like a quid pro quo thing. So we gave them the penguins, they allowed us to have the independence referendum. Seemed like a good swap. Yeah.
You're a dad, Jamie. Would you take your daughter to go and see these penguins?
Yeah, I mean, I went to the aquarium for her first birthday, actually, the one in Loch Lomond, where they did, I mean, they've got a bit of a bigger, it's a bit bigger thing there. Just generally,
Is it the whole loch?
It's the whole loch, yeah, that's where they hold the monster. The monster's down there if you wait long enough. I, like you, have been to that aquarium many times growing up in London. I was also quite disappointed by the whole concept. I think that clip that we played sounded like something from Brass Eye. Like the way that, he was kind of anthropomorphizing the penguins that were standing, watching, staring at the wall, while also then asking leading questions of the children, being like, do you think they should be free? It's like that to me is a really amusing way to enter this story. I think, like, I agree with the idea that they should have more space. I think it's absolutely mad that they've never seen the sky. That sounds really horrible for anyone, and particularly a penguin. But I also understand that their argument is that it meets all of the regulations. I mean, the answer is basically, are the regulations that are in place by the government about aquariums correct? Because if the regulations allow this existence, then the aquarium is doing everything that they should do. But if the regulations need revising, and that actually we need to put the penguins in a better space, and there is also an argument about education. I was a boy from Lewisham. I was never going to see a penguin, but I got to see a penguin in the aquarium.
No, but that's right. But you can see a penguin at London Zoo, or you can see a penguin at Whipsnade, which is better cared for than those penguins. I mean, that's evident.
I don't know where Whipsnade is, mate.
It's on the Dunstable Downs.
Yeah, there are.
Okay.
It's not relevant.
There are penguins. There are penguins kept in 46 zoos and aquariums all over the UK, and some of them are critically endangered species. The ones in London Zoo are Humboldt penguins that are from South America. The difference with these ones is two things. Firstly, they're Gentoo penguins, which are from Antarctica. And there's only a couple of other places in the UK that has Gentoos, like the Deep in Hull, for example, has them. They're part of a European breeding program. There's a couple of other places. But basically, it's the species of penguin here that's considered to be the issue, in that they are from
but so
such
just to interrupt there, and I know that Merlin say, we're doing everything within our powers, and it's species dependent, as you say, but there is also just build a bigger enclosure then. Like, okay, they have to be indoors and they have to be climate controlled, but build a bigger enclosure. The only reason not to do that is it's going to take up more real estate and cost more money. I mean, that's clearly the only reason not to do that.
Yeah, ultimately, the bottom line will come down to money, and it'll be really bad PR for them to admit that they've been in the wrong place for 14 years, This Merlin Entertainments, which is this theme park giant that owns all these attractions, they have got their reputation to consider, and they've got money to consider. They can't necessarily now agree with what everyone's been saying. Like the law in the UK is that zoos have to provide captive animals with conditions that meet all their needs. The claim is that Sea Life isn't doing that. If they were now to build a bigger enclosure, they would be admitting that they weren't doing that. Whereas obviously their claim and their defense is that they are. There are some difficulties in terms of what you can actually do with this species of penguins and where you can put them. But one criticism is that this species of penguin is not very endangered. So you can't really make an argument for like a breeding program being like help for conservation. You also can't generally make that argument because there's been hundreds of conservation breeding programs in zoos, and it doesn't actually help any wild populations recover. They don't actually release the animals back into the wild. The thing is that there are allegations across the UK about a pattern of penguin mortalities, that penguins that are being kept in zoos that are kind of sort of secretly dying or having very high mortality rates, particularly as chicks. And the claim is that they are not suited to captivity, that they don't adapt well to a sedentary lifestyle. They don't adapt well to not being able to dive hundreds of meters and swim super fast and travel a really long distance every day. Captivity exposes them to diseases and infections. Concrete enclosure floors can increase like risks of their foot pads becoming infected. So there are criticisms not just of this specific penguin enclosure, although it is a very stark and horrible example, but there are criticisms of keeping penguins in captivity across the UK in general.
I've got a question. What is the collective noun for a group of penguins?
Great question.
Parade.
A parade.
Is it? Oh,
Brilliant.
That's cute.
I'm happy now.
Everything about penguins makes you smile, doesn't it? Apart from infant
this
mortality,
story.
obviously. Yes, yeah, but actually, just
Bit of a black parade if we're talking about all the mortality rates.
it is. But I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? Ultimately, people like seeing penguins. They're going to want to see them somewhere. There isn't going to be any truck for a rule that says we can't have penguins in captivity. It's a question about what captivity is provided, isn't it? I mean, do you think, Felicity, we are a nation of animal lovers, as you suggest, that there will be space on the floor of the House of Commons to discuss this one day?
I think it will. I honestly think this story will keep growing, and I don't think it's a good enough excuse to say we're following the regulations, because you can bring any set of rules or laws to the table and say I'm following it, and if that rules and laws is like fundamentally morally wrong, that is not a good enough excuse. And it's quite clear to everyone who is visiting and seeing this that something's not wrong and that it should change. And it makes me think of the it's a bit old now, but the Blackfish documentary, I want to say 2012, so it's old, but
About the orcas at SeaWorld.
Yeah. And again, it was funny in a way, because I remember watching it and being like, God, I never went to SeaWorld as a kid, but we just grew up and thought that they seemed happy and the dolphins are smiling and you can swim with them and everything's great. And then actually there's this hideous dark underbelly of how they're being treated that was just awful, to the point where the whale turns psychotic and tries to murder one of the divers. It's an incredible documentary. I highly recommend it. But those penguins do not look happy. I don't think the response from Merlin is good enough. And I hope this will grow. And yeah, free the 15.
Jamie, does it have your support too?
Absolutely. I think it's a big vote winner. I can't wait for the Reform government to free all of the penguins, and gets my vote.
I should say, whilst we've been having this conversation, my window looks out into my garden and I keep chickens. And weirdly, whilst we've been talking about freeing animals from captivity, my chickens have both just flown over the cage and into the garden to peck around. I don't know if they're trying to send me a signal. I guess they have the freedom to do that and they come back for their food. My thanks to Felicity, to Jamie and to Harriet. You can follow this show for free, like Willy, and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, where you can watch us as well. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer, Ollie Peart, free as a bird at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.